We've pasted a link to some of your valuable resources you've been putting out on COVID. You have a specific COVID page on the ESS website, and you've also produced a webinar about evaluating in a time of change. Now that will be in our minds as we go through the next half hour or so together, but it was in my mind that evaluation might be less of a priority for organisations at the moment, but it seems to be in many cases more of a priority, and I think you've had a lot of demand for your services at the moment as well.
Yes, that's right. It's been quite a test, I think, to see can anyone be bothered with evaluation when you're to work out how to plug your laptop in, or you've got crises to meet, service users with lots of important issues to address. And I think initially the answer was no, nobody wanted to hear about evaluation. But now, as indeed the discussions before the break seems to suggest, people are realizing that actually learning is even more important. And it's been quite good for us because we've always been banging on at Evaluation Support Scotland, as you have too, Graeme, that learning is the most important driver. Sometimes we do have to do a bit of evaluation for accountability, but actually one of the good things around COVID is that there's been a wee bit more trust, I think, certainly of some third sector organisations just to get on with it. And so that's good because we don't have to do evaluation for justification, but we do need to do evaluation for learning. And that's what we've been hearing the sector saying, as we want to learn, just as your colleagues have been talking about, we want to learn what we've been doing differently through COVID that's been working, that we want to keep doing. And we want to learn more about what people's needs are and how well we're meeting them. And we also want a bit of feedback to help us help us celebrate a bit, because we're all struggling a bit and it can be quite exhausting sitting on Zoom all day, every day and being stuck in your house. So actually having some service user feedback that helps us feel, yeah, we're doing all right is even more important, I think, right now than it has been before.
It'd be good to get your advice, actually, because what you've made me think of is I was talking to somebody last week who felt that ethically they shouldn't be evaluating at the moment because people have so many other things to worry about in communities. And my answer was, how ethical is it not to ask people what matters to them?
Yes, I think that's absolutely right. I think we do want to make decisions on behalf of service users about what they do or do not want to do. We have to make sure that we ask them. We can't ask them in an overly burdensome way, and we certainly want to think about the questions we want to ask them. But asking, am I meeting your needs? I think I totally agree with you, Graeme. I think not asking that question would be unethical rather than asking it. So light touch, straightforward, useful, but yeah, keep asking, am I meeting your needs, and am I doing what you need?
I'm conscious that the people who are with us today, the fund is core funding. Some people have developed new services and new ways of working in response to that, but I think probably nevertheless they will be interested in some of what you're saying about light touch and delivery focused evaluation. But what does light touch and appropriate unburdensome evaluation look like?
So useful, I think, is the most important word. So at any time, actually, I don't think this is specific to COVID. I think at any time we should really always be asking ourselves and our service users the questions that we actually want the answer to. So fundamentally, we want to actually gather data that will help us understand what difference we made, keep doing the things that are working, stop doing the things or change the things that are a bit less successful, and identify the things that we're not doing that we should be doing. So useful data and evidence, stuff that tells us things that will help us make good decisions. And also, I think as well, most of the time we want to be evaluating for ourselves, what difference are we making and what do we want to do? But many third sector organizations also have a campaigning or policy influencing role. So using evaluation to gather data and evidence that will help us influence others is sometimes useful for some organizations too. And that's definitely true right now. In fact, there's quite an appetite in Scottish Government. I was on a session with Aileen Campbell, the Cabinet Secretary, yesterday. Some people might have been on it too. And she was talking a lot about gathering learning for informing the recovery process. And there's no question that third sector organisations will have really useful data, evidence and learning to share that will help us create a better Scotland, I think, post-COVID than perhaps we had before.
It was before you arrived, we were talking about the myth of perpetual motion and the belief that work can just carry on without resources. And one of the practices we recommend in response to that is to be influencing and shaping policy. And in funds like this, which are government money that's being administered, there's usually a very open invitation to use evidence to inform learning and for people to report in ways that shares that learning. So is that your experience, that there's even more appetite and opportunities for that at the moment?
Yeah. Yes, I think there definitely is. I mean, not all funders are the same, but certainly funders and government are national government seemingly asking for that. In fact, in some respects, we've all been a bit overloaded with requests for information. So there's been quite a lot of surveys going around. Oscar had one recently. There's been quite a few. Some of those surveys are less about impact and more about just, what are your needs right now and what's going on. And certainly I've been talking to SCVO about how we can coordinate some of that research and survey work and pull it all together to have a better understanding about what's going on across the sector, and also move the conversation on from what are all the problems to what are we learning about the solutions, and where are still the gaps, I think. To answer your question, there's definitely a lot of appetite.
We do have some membership organisations here today, so it might be useful to hear from them either by coming into the conversation or in the chat box about how you've been going about hearing what matters to people in communities, because you're right, I've been working with a membership organisation that you know very well, Stephen, the Coalition of Care Providers, CCPS in Scotland, and we've been doing some what we've called very light touch research. So we've created an online Trello board, which is a website where we can post our learning just from sessions like this, conversations like this, just really unintrusively. So not doing surveys, not doing questionnaires, but in the intelligence gathering that we all have the chance to do in sessions like this, to be finding out what matters to the sector. But you're right, there comes a point where we do need more evidence. So either for the membership organisations, or I think more broadly for everyone else who's here today, that's questions now starting to appear, Stephen, for us in the chat box. What sort of evidence will people use to make decisions? I think the way that you put it is to make decisions. What sort of evidence do they need, and how can they get it? Not just at the moment when it's difficult, but generally, how do people get good quality evidence that helps make decisions? And then we can come maybe on to Jackie's question about where does consultation stop and evaluation begin?
Yeah, that's a good question. So I'll answer yours first. So, I mean, one challenge I think some organisations will be having in terms of evaluation is, where is their data and evidence? The answer to that question is in the office that they can't access. Some challenging things, I think.
Does that mean we don't have to do it then?
Well, hopefully not. But I think we've all been tested a bit about how good are our databases, where are our systems and evidence, and particularly for organisations in this fund who might be wanting to look back over 4 years, they might that might even be more difficult at this time. So I suppose I'm just acknowledging that challenge, and we need to do the best we can with what we have and where we can find it. But one of the interesting things, I think, at sort of organizational level for some of the organizations here who are receiving sort of core funding, is to think about where the whole can be greater than the sum of the parts. So many organizations have maybe quite good evaluation systems at a project level. They're delivering a specific service for service users. They've got outcomes and evaluation systems in place. Some of the organizations in this webinar today might be wanting to think about, actually, we've got a whole range of different projects and we want to pull that together. And so for some organizations, that means a unifying set of outcomes, maybe some organizational level outcomes, a few key differences that you want to make right across the organization, or some key questions that you want to answer right across those organizations, and trying to have something quite simple at the organizational level, maybe driven by the mission. That's about what's the overall picture, and then kind of going back down into where does that evidence come from at the project organizational level. And we ran a webinar on that recently. There's some more information on our website. In terms of where the evidence might be for those kind of overarching outcomes, we talk about sort of 6 sources of evidence. So first of all, there's feedback from the people that you work with. And maybe that helps go into Jackie's very good question, because consultation, she's absolutely right, and evaluation do overlap. And you probably want to do a bit of both at the same time. You know, have I made a difference to you, and what needs do you still have? is a question that asks is both consultative and about impact. And so as if you can be clever, you can maybe ask both questions at the same time. But perhaps also the key point is to make sure that you are not just always consulting about the next need, but also finding ways to understand the impact that you've made with and for the people that you work with. And you'll be doing that perhaps through surveys or questionnaires, but you'll also do that through the ongoing delivery of work. And the more we can build feedback from service users into the way we deliver our services, the better and the easier it is for us to do that. And that's some of the things that we've got on our website. So service user feedback is important. Third-party feedback might be important from partners or from parents, carers, referrers, other people who we're working with who might be able to tell us something unique and interesting about the difference that we've made to the people that we're working with. And our own observation as people who are delivering services is a really key source of evidence, particularly if you're doing work with groups of people. You might see impact that you don't necessarily, that the individuals themselves don't necessarily see. And then there's the kind of, so those are the human bits of feedback. And then there's our internal files, there's the statistics, various bits of case notes and so on that will also have useful data and evidence about impact and learning. And it may be that some of the services that are on this webinar may also be regulated services. So if you have been inspected by Education Scotland or the Care Inspectorate, then you may also have those kinds of reports that may also give you useful data and evidence and learning that help sort of feed into the story. So the overall message, I think, here is that it's a patchwork, and it probably needs to be a collaborative process as well in your organisation about trying to pull together different team members' observations and different team members' evidence, and pulling it from different places and different sources.
That's really helpful. Thank you, Stephen. And the idea of using inspection results will definitely be relevant for a lot of people, and also the validity of our own observations, where perhaps maybe children aren't able to express, or people who lack confidence or have different challenges to actually giving feedback or planning their next steps. We might see things that they're not, and that's perfectly legitimate. So it's the idea of a patchwork, or I know in the past you've used the metaphor of mosaic. Is that piecing it all together?
Absolutely. Thank you.
And apologies if it was distracting as I was typing up as you were speaking. We've just recorded some notes there on the screen, which hopefully you can see. So we've had some response to the patchwork is making sense to people, and at the same time another question appeared, Stephen, about how to plan and I think how to balance qualitative evaluation versus quantitative, which can be overwhelming. I think, feel free to come in, the person who asked the question, if I'm getting this wrong, but I think what's being suggested there is that quantitative information in particular can create an overwhelming volume of information, and qualitative can create overwhelming depth of information. How do we plan that to get the balance right and the volume right? I think that's what's being asked.
Yes, well, I'll say a bit and then Marguerite might want to come in and say more. So we sometimes talk about stats and stories, which I think is the same thing. And as Marguerite is implying here, you need a bit of both. The stats give you a sense of who you've worked with, the numbers of people, and the stories give you that qualitative in-depth information. And you kind of need a mix of both. I think we're back to what's useful, that question, that driver. So you might have some need to understand reach. Who have you worked with? Who have you made the most difference to? What are the general numbers? But you also need that qualitative stuff to understand the real, the whole story of the impact that you're making. And it's difficult to get that, and not practical to get that from everybody that you work with. So that's why it's useful to get a mix of both. And I suppose as just thinking about what is absolutely useful to you as an organization will help you understand the balance. We produced a resource called Stats and Stories that's on our website that helps people think through those questions for themselves, and a little bit about how you turn stories into stats. So how you might analyze a series of stories and say, well, this is the number of people whose stories tell us this thing, but also stats into stories. What do the stats actually tell us in terms of who we're reaching, and what matters to people? So I'm not sure I've quite answered Marguerite's question, but I suppose the ideal is to, good, thank you. Ideal is to have a mix of both and to think about what's most useful to overall tell the impact of your work.
That's so useful. Thank you.
Stephen.
Thanks, Marguerite. So if you didn't hear that, that was just a thank you, Stephen. So it's about what's useful, and we'll provide a link to the Stats and Stories resource, Stephen, in the notes from today. As you'll know, there are approximately 120 organisations in the fund, of which we've got about a third here today. So we'll share more widely with people who are not here. Feel free if there are other things. There's been a couple of responses as to how membership organisations have engaged beforehand and want to time it right. I think a lot of this is about timing. And I don't know if you have a view, Stephen, about how people, possibly a longer term thing, but how people use the evidence that they're gathering now to inform future planning and funding. One of the so when we first were planning this workshop, what we were anticipating was people planning ahead into March next year, maybe September and beyond, once they know what's happening with this fund in particular. But the more that time goes on, what people were saying in the breakout room this morning was, the more that time goes on, the harder it gets to transition to your previous ways of working, or to anticipate the transition to the new. So how do people use the evidence that they've been gathering, and when's the best opportunity for using that for planning and funding for the future?
So I've seen a really nice matrix that the RSA have produced, and I'll send you, Graeme, a link so you can pass it on to others. But it has basically talked about 4 things to think about right now. So this is a COVID-specific answer. And I guess you've probably already been covering this earlier on, but there's kind of 4 questions you might ask, which is, what have we started doing as a result of COVID that we actually quite like and we're going to keep doing? So at Evaluation Support Scotland, we're delivering all of our support and training using Zoom. And actually, we're thinking, well, some of this is working quite well, and it might be a thing we want to keep doing, particularly for people who are far away from us, geographically distant. But then what are the things that we started doing as a result of COVID that we really don't want to keep doing, because they're just not helping us make the best impact that we want to make? So those are the 2 started questions. And then on the stopped questions, there's what have we stopped doing as a result of COVID that we actually don't want to go back to doing, because in fact, we don't miss it. We've now realized it wasn't particularly impactful, or we were made to do it by our funder, and now we've been able to stop doing it and nobody's noticed. So, and then the final question is, what have we stopped doing that we really need to go back to, because somehow or other we're just not quite achieving positive outcomes without going back to that thing? And there'll be all of us who will have face-to-face delivery options that we need to go back to, because that's the best way to help improve people and communities' resilience, confidence, and connections. But those 4 questions I quite like, and even just asking yourself those questions and then thinking, well, what data, evidence, learning do I have that helps me answer those questions? Both, and this will be organisations' own observations and team discussions, but also those feedback from service users who will be telling us, this has been really helpful, or we really missed this, or the thing that most made the difference to me was. Those kinds of questions could be really quite helpful. So those are the COVID-specific questions. And then more generally, I think, just kind of looking back over the whole 4 years, helping to sort of focus your thinking around, overall, what did we do, and what difference did we make, and what were the most effective things that we did that really made the difference, and what are the things that maybe that have emerged over the last 4 years where we think actually we didn't make quite such a difference, or it was a new need, and where might we want to sort of target our efforts in the future.
So those are, I mean, they're fantastic. And the little scribble I was drawing on the screen was, I'm assuming this is a 2x2 matrix of some kind. And like Jackie's saying in the chat box, those are brilliant strategic planning questions anyway, for long term anyway. But you're adding to that, again, the question of usefulness and effectiveness. which has been really your touchstone all the way through, is working at what's the most effective stuff to be gathering about how effective we are. So we have the opportunity for another few comments or questions, if there are any from the floor. And to just put that in context, where we're headed next is we'll move into a breakout activity in 10 minutes time if we need more. Can we put the questions into chat? Possibly, Jacqueline. It depends on my capability with the platform, or if I put them back up on the slides here, we won't lose those. I'll keep them there for you. Where we're headed is a breakout conversation, which Stephen will be part of. He'll be joining one of your groups to talk about the evidence that you have and how you can use it to measure your effectiveness and to inform your learning for the future, and how to be using it in particular. So thank you, Katrina, for typing up for us. That's really useful. And there's the link from Stephen to the RSA resource. That's brilliant. Thank you. The other aspect I think will be relevant for people is a slightly more technical one, which is linking. You mentioned setting up a core group of organizational outcomes, and how we link those to funders' requirements and funders' outcomes. We've spoken this morning about octopuses and the paradox of being octopus shaped, that we need to reach out in new directions, but if we get pulled in too many directions, we just spread ourselves too thin, and we have mission drift. How do we align organizational outcomes to funder outcomes or policy outcomes without getting pulled out of shape?
Yes, and this is a perennial question, as you say, and we, I suppose the first point is about organizational confidence. So actually have your own outcomes, use the words that work for you and your service users, be clear about what difference you're trying to make. Remember that probably as a charity or a third sector organization, you've been set up with a real need in mind, so that there's all that going on. And so have those outcomes front and center, and don't try and adopt the wording of funders, which are going to change anyway, but actually use your own. And then, of course, it is a mapping exercise. So it's about saying, I'm saying these words, they actually link to your words, oh funder, over here, and this is the connection. And it's about making that kind of link and trying to do that sort of mapping process, but also being confident about saying we're contributing. So the big message about it's not attribution. No individual organization all by itself is going to achieve world peace and eliminate poverty. We're all contributing. And so actually, again, having a really strong sense of where's my piece of the jigsaw, what's the bit that my organization is helping to achieve, and how are we contributing to those overall funder outcomes. And indeed, it might even be the National Performance Framework outcomes. We've been working with some organisations who've been using the Scottish Government's National Performance Framework outcomes and saying, what's our bit of the story and how do we map our work onto the National Performance Framework outcomes? And the Scottish Government's been really excited by that kind of work to show that the third sector really is contributing and can make those connections.
I mean, you've alluded to this a couple of times. I think first of all, to remember the context within Scotland, that we have a relatively flat access to, relatively flat sector and relatively easy access to policy through things like our reports to funders. Are there opportunities? Do you think, Stephen? It sounds like you're excited, and other people are excited that there might be new opportunities coming and new trust and respect for third sector evidence.
I hope so. Certainly Aileen Campbell, the minister, yesterday in this event that I was in, was definitely suggesting that was true. She was also acknowledging that may not be true universally across all bits of Scottish government. Mm-hmm. Of course, local government is patchy too, we know that. So let's not we need to be careful not to get too excited and hear the positive messages from the people that agree with us and ignore the fact that there are lots of other people who might be less interested. But definitely there is an appetite for third sector evidence. And there's always been a slightly more helpfully broad understanding of evidence and learning, and with a focus on, for example, lived experience evidence in Scotland. As you know, Graeme, you've done a lot of work in this area, where national government recognises that the experience of people who are living with the issues and the evidence that they generate about both need and impact is really valid and important, and the third sector is very well placed to gather that and then present that back.
So you've maybe answered the next question, which I was going to suggest might be a concluding question, unless there's anything else from our colleagues here today, before we then move on, which is, if those opportunities are there, how can the organisations present and how can the third sector generally really make sure that that door is opened wider, and that their evidence is used?
So I think there's a really important role for intermediaries here, and we're lucky in that we have lots of great intermediaries in Scotland. Obviously, SCVO plays the overarching role, but there's lots of subject intermediaries, and perhaps some of them are on this event today.
Yes, they are.
Fantastic. So I think they've got a really useful role to play in gathering learning data and evidence from their member organisations. And being a conduit. One of the really key roles I think the intermediaries always play is looking in both directions, looking in one way to government and policymakers and other funders, and looking back to their members. So that can be a really useful source. And SCVO is also very interested, I think, in understanding how it can add value to the subject intermediaries. And of course, at the geographically local level, we've got TSIs as well. So I think that's a really key area, but that shouldn't stop individual organizations themselves, picking the opportunities that they can, finding their local MSP, having those connections and relationships they might have with their local authority, and getting in whenever they can, finding the things that the funders and policymakers want to know, and offering those answers where they can.
So actually, it's a parallel of where we came in, which was don't assume that we know what families, children and communities want. Likewise, don't assume we know what funders or policy makers or other decision makers want. Actually, there's always a process of working out what information is actually going to be useful for our end user before we then start gathering it.
Yes, absolutely.
Thank you. That's a nice return to where we've started. As you've been speaking, we've pasted a link to the stats and stories, because I think that idea has gone down well, and we're definitely grateful for the link to the matrix that you've given us to RSA. That's really useful. Thank you.